Hi guys! Today we are going to talk about Eastern Europe, post-Soviet space and democratic backsliding with Professor of International Relations at London School of Economics, Tomila Lankina. Nice to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
And we will start firstly with the more global things. We will talk. Let's talk about the processes that happened after the dissolution of Soviet Union. First of all, why do you think the democratization unfolds so differently in different parts of Western Bloc, in different parts of European part of Soviet Union? Why it went in such countries as Ukraine, Georgia, Baltics, Romania this way, the way we saw more successful, and in Russia and Belarus completely differently.
Yes. So I usually look for deep historical explanations. I'm not a big fan of accounts that focus almost exclusively on elites or agency or contingencies or recent developments or institutional choices of strategically placed political actors in the 1990s, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern communist bloc of the disintegrated countries. I tend to focus on historical factors like the legacies of um, democratic statehood, experience of democratic statehood going back in time, that is before communism, and also the legacies of imperial rule by different empires. We know that the tapestry of colonial rule in this part of the world is very complex, and some countries like Ukraine, even within Ukrainian territory, for instance, um, as indeed some parts of Russia, if we think about Kaliningrad, have very, very different histories from before communist incorporation of these territories. And so how they developed after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in terms of their democratic statehood and even the regions and different sub-regions within these countries is also very much influenced by the kinds of experiences of democratic institutions, civil society, and even things like literacy. I find, for instance, records of education and development of literacy across these different territories really varied um, significantly even before communism. But also, religion is very important here. In my own recent work on the history of Russian descent, I talk a lot about patterns and histories that very few people talk about, such as the legacies of sectarian movements and Christian movements not associated with the official Orthodox Church. And I think that kind of research also applies to other parts of the different other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, in your works in general, and in one of your recent works on Russian state revolutionary democratic traditions, you are claiming that this, so let's call it democratic culture, can survive totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. So how come it can survive? What are the maybe special conditions that allows certain democratic memory to remain and then to thrive again after uh, dozens of years under totalitarian regime, as we can saw that, for instance, in the case of Georgia and other post-Soviet countries.
Mhm. So culture is a notoriously slippery concept. It's very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to know what is really culture, what we mean by that. But certainly there are particular attitudes and values that citizens were able to preserve even through the communist experience. Let me give you an example. In the Gulag, in Stalin's brutal labor camps, um, people were still able to carry their values and preserve them despite the very brutal and inhumane circumstances. And Solzhenitsyn, in his famous work on Gulag Archipelago, he talks, for instance, about religious believers and people of faith who, no matter what privations, no matter what they were forced to do, they still kept to their faith. And everybody else admired these people. How did they manage to preserve such core strengths of their belief, despite the kind of overall atheistic and brutal circumstances of the communist experiment? The communist experiment is also presents challenges for people who talk about cultural reproduction, because so many people, entire nations, were moved and uprooted, as you well know, from their historical homelands. Certainly happened with peoples in the North Caucasus, and taken to Siberia, the Central Asia. And yet, despite this uprooting, they managed to preserve their values. The question is how.
Exactly.
That's the question you ask. And so one of the mechanisms I find in my work, and this is again something that political scientists don't always talk about, is we have to look at what happens in the family. So even the brutal so-called totalitarian experience, I prefer the word totalizing, because it captures attempts to control everything, but an attempt is an attempt. It doesn't mean it succeeds. So totalizing societies try to control all aspects of public and private life. But of course they fail, because parents still manage to transmit values to their children in the privacy of their home, religious faith. And also in my latest book on the history of dissent, where I don't just talk about Russia, but also compare the sovereign countries that used to be part of the communist project, like Georgia, like Armenia, like Ukraine, the Baltic states. And I talk about the different traditions of protest and mobilizing to challenge state authority. So I argue that countries that had to fight colonial domination, uh, and I compare Russia and Ukraine, especially, that's an interesting comparison, and indeed Russia and Georgia there, or the Baltic states. So countries that have been colonized and had to fight domination in that often took the form of linguistic attempts at linguistic assimilation, Russification, attempts to impose control over the local churches. These attempts often backfired because they, around causes of national liberation, people rallied in the way that we, for instance, do not find in Russian society, which did not have to fight that same battle of national liberation in the same way. Because no matter what Putin tells you and tells the public about Russia being victimized historically, being subjected to attempts to subjugate, and not least with NATO expansion, one hears these stories. um, it's actually Russian society did not have to fight and mobilize around issues of national liberation, other than for the brief, relatively historically speaking, brief period of the Second World War, which in Russia they call Great Patriotic War, Napoleon's invasion. But these are events that that covered a few years in time, not decades, and certainly not centuries. And of course, if we can go back to the Mongol rule as well. But if we look at the modern period, Russia itself had not been subjected to the same kind of colonial domination that other nations like Poland, Ukraine, and certainly countries, nations in the Caucasus have been. And so this experience of not fighting for your rights as a nation, as an ethnic group, demobilized Russian society in the way that it didn't. The other societies certainly had an experience of opposing state authority that they perceived to be alien and not their own. And that kind of experience, as one speaker at an LSE talk, Mrs. Yushchenko, said a couple of years ago when she came with the former president of Ukraine to give a talk. She said that resilience, and talking about Ukrainian society, of course, resilience comes from fighting the same battles over and over again, the same struggles. And so you develop this resilience in resisting attempts at domination. That is one of those values, right, that we talk about. How does it get transmitted? It gets transmitted through the practice of resisting domination. And so certainly this challenging attitude towards political authority is what gets citizens really is what translates into more plural, more competitive political system, because you have a more active civil society that's not so easily trampled upon. I mean, look at the tens of thousands of people who come out on the streets in Georgia, just like last year, I believe, last summer. Unfortunately, I was invited to go. I couldn't go because my hosts in Georgia canceled the trip. But for my safety, I would have loved to go and be witness to these historical events. But certainly, you see the kind of resilience, and as I write in my book on the history of Russian descent, ultimately success in these mobilizations is down to numbers of people who come out on the streets, numbers of days they stay on the streets, numbers of weeks, and numbers, of people they can bring with them, friends, relatives, grandmothers, grandfathers. So it's all about numbers, and numbers scare autocrats. We have had Russian mobilizations as well, but certainly they tend to peter out more quickly. So in terms of trying to explain variations, what I say really points to several different historical factors, like fighting colonial subjugation, like a kind of particular religious tradition, for instance, within Russia, associated with non-mainstream churches, alternative religions, legacy of education, because ultimately illiteracy is not very good for fostering a critical attitude towards political authority. All of these factors combined, we know from from academic studies and research, they can play a significant role and really have a lasting effect in terms of political outcomes now.
Yeah, in this regard, that you mentioned the risk correlation between facing external threats and having this resilience, which helps, after all, to evolve into a democracy. So, does this mean that Russia and countries like Russia, they lack the this experience of external threats in their history? So, and if so, if they lack this experience, if they lack this fear, let's say this common threat that they had in their past, that making them stick together and fight for democracy, fight for the rights, does that mean that in order to change Russia, we need to, let's say, make Russia face this threat?
So let me also elaborate. What I mean also, and this is all I write about in my latest book, is every society is divided in a kind of socioeconomic sense, right? There are societal divisions, rich, poor people. The Russian Empire has been divided into Saslovia, which is translated as a states, very imperfect translation because it's confusing, as states générales, in French, we know from the French Revolution. So Russian society was divided into the states of, at the very top, aristocrats and personal nobles, clergy, the urban estates of merchants, meshani, and artisans, and at the very bottom, peasants. Peasant society was in turn divided into serfs and state peasants, that is more free and and also private, more independent peasants. There were also other categories of citizens, who were also considered estates, like Cossacks and others. Inarodцы, that is
Foreign.
well, it's like a native peoples were, like in Siberia, for instance, they had that status as well. But the point is that these kinds of archaic pre-modern divisions in Russia lasted for a very long time, and they were much more entrenched than most people realize in the Russian Empire. Russia also imposed this kind of social division in territories it colonized. But what it did for Russian society is it tragically crippled people's capacity to unite around a common political cause, because the peasants never identified, for instance, the peasants, the vast majority of the population, depending on the territory, really we're talking 80-90% of the population. And then 10% maybe plus, the more what I call educated Sasovia, clergy, nobles, merchants, mishani. But peasant society historically separate from these other educated groups. They didn't even speak the same language. Of, as you know, the aristocracy spoke French for a long time. They had French and European tutors, etc. And the peasants were mostly illiterate. Okay, so these kinds of divisions existed across the Russian Empire and in territories it colonized. But for the minority nations, the subjugated groups fighting the colonial oppressor helped them unite, the people unite and move away from these socioeconomic divisions that were deeply entrenched. But Russia, and most people don't quite think about it in those terms, but Russia never got away from that social division. So the Russian state division of society into Sasovia, creating a lasting created a lasting legacy that survived and actually in modified form in many ways reproduced itself through the communist period. And the question is, what is so different about, for instance, Russian society and let's say Ukrainian society, or Georgian society, even though all these nations have also been subjected not just to Russian imperial, but also communist colonial rule. And yet we see more protest and greater sort of democratic impulse among the citizenry. And again, when I mentioned earlier, protest and civil society and effective mobilization against autocratic rulers is about numbers. People are able to come together in one big swell of solidarity for a long period of time. And for some reason or another, Russians do not show that same power in numbers, the same strength in numbers as do these other nations, which it might be also because of the territorial size. Russia is a giant country, and it's very difficult for people who live in different territories to feel a common sense of citizenship and belonging. But it's also about those legacies of social division, and which the national liberation struggles that happened in other places, they were not able to bridge. So in places like Georgia or Ukraine, you see people really passionate about a cause that gives them experience of fighting for their freedom, and that gives them also experience of bridging their socioeconomic divide. So as Georgians or as Ukrainians, whether you're peasant or lord, you would come out and protest against an autocratic regime. And in Russia, I think because of these factors that I mentioned, we see a different picture. So that's one important element in the kind of social and institutional tapestry whereby Russia developed in very different ways from some of the other countries that we consider as part of that whole communist experience block of countries, but actually they're very, very different in terms of their socioeconomic makeup, cultural outlook, and experience of fighting tyranny.
Yeah. So now I'd like to talk about more what is going on with Ukraine and in terms of Russian foreign policy. How do you see? Is there any direct link between what we have just discussed, the domestic stance of Russian society and its foreign policy and the way it behaves, and what drives Russian, so let's say imperialism and what makes Russian government take steps and in a way to occupy other countries' territories.
Yeah, so actually, this talk about Russian protests is precisely motivated by the puzzle of the relative passivity of Russians in the face of their country's aggression against a sovereign nation. And, one could interpret it in terms of not very unflatteringly, in terms of lack of consideration for the lives lost. But then one could also ask why Russians themselves have lost so many people. And yet, there are so many coffins coming back, so many burials. We know that we don't have the exact number, but there are so many victims of Putin's war in Russia itself, not just outside of Russia. And yet, we don't see a massive mm, movement against the war. There is a movement, there is a feminist anti-war resistance movement. I have huge and tremendous respect for people like our Rosman, who is one of the activists. There are a lot of really brave people who are resisting it. But ultimately, we don't see the same kind of successful movement against the war that we saw, for instance, with the anti-Vietnam. Uh,
It is
um,
not that widespread. So, yeah.
it's not as socially encompassing, right, as one would have thought. So again, I'm coming back to this question of why. And the answer I find is in the social divides, and because when the society is so divided and so few people identify with the small group of habitually traditionally educated elites who are westernized, who live in large cities, many of whom have fled and are living abroad, and but we forget about when we've just focused on that small group of anti-war resistors and intellectuals, we forget about the mass of Russian society, which basically in some ways there is a kind of that social division between the vast majority that used to be peasants. Not all of them were serfs, but a large chunk had been serfs until 1860s, and illiterate at that, or semi-literate, very large percentage of the population on the one hand, and on the other hand, a very small minority in a social sense detached, but also in an institutional sense. All these Saslovia, they had their own corporate bodies of self-governance, Saslovne общества they were called, Mishanskaya, Dvaryanskaya, you know, they all governed themselves, they all developed very different identities. Okay, the Soviet experience obliterated those identities in some ways, but the kind of the big social divide between the small intelligentsia, urban, educated, and the vast majority of subjects never disappeared. And so we see these people continually not speaking the same language. Um, and that makes it very easy for tyrants like Putin to create a kind of consensus around the war, to manipulate public opinion, because ultimately the social majority has not really changed much from Tsarist times or from communist times, where many people were trapped in the collective farms without, they didn't even have passports for many years, and were only allowed to leave the entrapment of the kolkhoz collective farm in the 1960s. And so you have this social spatial division as well, people trapped in their rural localities or small towns, and in many ways separated in a professional sense, in a cultural, social outlook, attitudinal sense from this small minority of citizens. So you have this kind of divided society that is not going to mobilize an effective response to the war, even if ultimately we think of the huge sacrifices that Russian society as well is paying for this war in terms of human lives, but also, the isolation. I know that the war is giving an economic boost to some hitherto deprived areas, regions, precisely because people who have been mobilized and then come back in a coffin or as a wounded soldier or severely disabled soldier, their families get huge payoffs that the families of these um, rural dwellers could never even dream of. Um, so that's having an economic boost. In that sense, there are perversely economically positive effects on some parts of the Russian economy and in some territories. But ultimately, Russia as a country is paying an enormous price in terms of isolation and of course human lives. And yet, we're not seeing a collective response to the war. So, is that because people genuinely support, to come back to your question about the agenda of imperialism? Do they genuinely fear NATO expansion? Do they genuinely fear the West? Do they genuinely support what Putin's saying? Yes and no. Yes, many people who are exposed to propaganda and brainwashing on state television, many people genuinely believe that. But we have to separate the messaging from what people used to believe. And before the propaganda started drilling the kind of fears of NATO into people's minds and psyche, I would bet that very few Russian babushkas somewhere in that, like some Urupinsk or some town, provincial town, would know what NATO is, what the acronym stands for, or would care about NATO. And so, who would know about intricacies of NATO expansion or the European Union for that matter. So this is all a bogus argument about supposed threats and concerns of the Russian people, of which there was very little evidence before the propaganda kicked in.
And one follow-up question: what goes first, imperialism or Russian authoritarian culture, if we can say that? What causes what?
It's probably a mix. I wouldn't even put it down. I wouldn't even describe it in terms of causality, because I think authoritarianism in many ways provides grounds for imperialism that remains unchallenged. Imperialism is imperial project is a very costly project. And there's always at some point imperial overexpansion. And in democratic societies, eventually the population starts demanding an end to empire, the domestic population, not just the colonized peoples, because of the costs. And in authoritarian countries like Russia, where autocracy kind of developed, I think the elements of autocracy were developing before Russia became an empire and really, as we know it, and really massively expanded, in eastwards and westwards. Russia already had if we look at the 17th century, when the big church schism happened and the Russian Orthodox Church became more subordinate over time, especially under Peter the First, to the state. We see already an important precondition for possible social impulse to resist autocracy disappearing slowly, because the clergy became one of the saslovia, really kind of very dependent on the state. And this organic unity and links between the Russian clergy and society, local rural society that existed before the schism and before Peter's reforms, and kind of progressively placed the church more and more under state control. So that didn't exist, in earlier periods of history. So Russia didn't become an autocracy overnight, but there were certain, and it didn't become an empire overnight. But these were two separate processes, I would say. But over time, an autocracy made it easier to keep an empire and to expand the empire, because the society was much more controlled and subjugated. And divided in the Saslovians, because by the way, Saslovia also emerged. They didn't exist all the time in Russian history. It's a product of, gradually, institutionally, they became enshrined in law. But so it's hard to pin a certain date. But I would say, and I'm not a historian, this is just my reading, very superficial reading of history. 17th century is when it all started. And so, this is how I would
Yeah,
answer.
asking that the short period of democracy that we've witnessed in 1990s, when Yeltsin's Russia showed the world a new democratic Russian Federation, and simultaneously it was doing the same stuff as it doing now in Georgia, in Moldova, Transnistria, Abkhazia, and the imperialism never left Russia, even under Yeltsin democratic, if we call Yeltsin Russia democracy regime. So I'm asking this question because now we see a lot of leaders of Russian opposition in the West claiming some certain things that kind of align with Russian imperialist project, and that raises concerns, especially among people from neighboring countries. Will Russia, democratic one, be non-imperialist state, or it will still be an imperialist country but with new, let's say, less bloody approach?
Mhm. Yes, the question about imperialism is an interesting one, and actually, I haven't really studied Russian imperialism as much as I have studied democracy and protests. But on the question about 1990s, it was a brief moment which was doomed because as I write in my book, the and it's a complex argument I'm making about how Russia developed into, the mainland state, which was autocratic, with full of, with divided into Sasovia, and then there were islands of freedom, islands that comprised of sectarians, non-Russian Orthodox affiliated different religions, who were and nations, nationalities, nations that were intrinsically oppositionist, right? So you have islands and you have this mainland state, and um, so that was a kind of feature historically. And in my book, I write that Yeltsin was a pretend islander. He positioned himself alongside the Baltic liberation movements, Ukrainians, etc., and ultimately was responsible for dissolution of the USSR partly. But he was a pretend, not a bona fide islander, because he was an apparatchik. It was a revolution of the apparatchiks, the dissolution of 1991. When it comes to Russia, right? The Russian movement of so-called movement of liberation from the Soviet Union, which is in itself absurd, right? The struggles, the national struggles of the republics, like the Caucasus, Baltic states, Ukraine, they were bona fide oppositionist mass, underpinned with mass movements, in a way that so-called Russian liberation from the Soviet Union, which is absurdity in itself, was not. And so this democracy was not to last because it was never underpinned by mass, genuinely sustained national mass liberation movements. There was the dissident movement of the 1960s, 1970s, petered away very quickly, confined to a small group of, when we talk about Russian, the Russian Republic, very small elites, mostly based in Leningrad and Moscow, and it did unite with dissidents from Baltic states and Ukraine, which were much more mass, and underpinned by stronger liberation movement. So, on your question of imperialism, um, does autocracy automatically lead to imperialism? I don't know. I don't think we have that evidence. I think it facilitates, in the Russian case, it facilitates whatever crackpot ideas like somebody like Putin might hatch in their head, because they can implement those crackpot ideas about other countries belonging to Russia somehow historically. Um, without much challenge from society. Society being autocratic. An autocratic society is a very poor shield against crackpot ideas of a despot like Putin. And this is where the danger lies. For instance, right now there are a lot of things happening in America with American democracy, but I have absolute faith that American democracy will resist. We're already seeing protests every weekend in so many different towns across America. Harvard University is just launching a major legal challenge to Trump's attempts at undermine academic freedom, freedom of universities. American society will withstand tyranny. And would Russia withstand if after Putin some other autocrat would come? Again, we will see the same kind of cycle of autocratic retrenchment and possibly imperialism.
Okay. Let's move on from Russia to some other countries of the region. Uh, Slovakia, Hungary, Georgia, all the brilliant examples of democratization after the collapse of Soviet Union. Once Georgia was told to be the lighter of democracy in the post-Soviet space, and now all of them are backsliding democracies, and some experts say that we will, in a couple of years, see them becoming normal Russia-looking authoritarian regimes. So my question is, what happened, and who is the next?
So what happened, I can give some partial answers. I think, and this is where authoritarian diffusion is also important. When I was a young researcher, young academic, just starting my career, I talked about democratic diffusion. Nobody could imagine. It was unthinkable. The term authoritarian diffusion didn't exist then in the 1990s, early 2000s. But here we are, so many years later, we talk about authoritarian diffusion. Russia has unfortunately also inherited the Soviet and especially the KGB institutional machinery and bureaucratic knowledge and institutional knowledge associated with special operations, infiltration, propaganda, political assassinations abroad, media manipulation, everything that the KGB was expert at doing. And not just the KGB, by the way, various propaganda agencies like Novosti Press, TASS, they had their own outlets across the globe and manipulate. They had so many local politicians on their payroll. All these things were happening through the decades of Soviet, communism. And essentially, Putin has resurrected all those techniques, and I would say quite successfully. And successfully also because when it comes to small countries, which were gradually, the media were already sort of gradually via various corporate schemes were integrated somehow into Russian commercial structures in some of these post-Soviet countries. I'm not sure exactly, but the thing, some countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia, Russian media moguls were able to purchase, stakes and media outlets. So it started, a long time ago, and then gradually it gave a foothold for these different manipulators, media manipulators, but also all kinds of other hybrid warfare type techniques. We know what they did in Abkhazia, they gave out Russian passports. We know they've been doing that in Ukraine, and also in the Baltics, they're involved in all kinds of special hybrid forms of infiltration and manipulation of the information space. And unfortunately, with small countries, it's much easier to do that than with larger states. Hungary is an interesting example of. I'm not an expert on Hungary, but Hungary is in many ways very similar to Russia. So the Hungarian democracy of the late 1980s, 1990s was also short-lived, and the question is why. Hungarian society was very similar to Russian society before communism, deeply divided, very strong landlordism, very subjugated peasant populations, not very well educated, and a small elite of urbanites. There were, German speakers, you know, uh, really educated bourgeoisie that were in some ways also detached from the kind of peasant society. And a lot of the manipulations we see in the Hungarian political landscape, I think, are also, you know, an extension of this kind of divided society with political operatives managing successfully to manipulate it during elections, in when it comes to the media space, because of these divisions, social resentments, and poor education of, I would conjecture, um, pre-communist times, of a large chunk of the population. So I'm being not an expert on Hungarian history. This is how I would interpret the short-lived Hungarian democracy and the emergence of a strongman who is able to manipulate, advance all kinds of anti-George Soros, anti-Semitic tropes, all those tropes that are meant to sow division in society or to exploit existing resentments in society that are deep seated and did not just disappear with communism or didn't just suddenly appear out of nowhere.
And in this regard, how do you think why the West was that slow to recognize and respond to authoritarian diffusion in?
The West was profiting mightily from, Russian investment in Russia. Germany was profiting from cheap Russian gas. This is all well known, and academic experts found themselves flailing hopelessly, trying to raise the attention to what Russia has been doing. I've been doing that for decades, and also talking to policymakers. And unfortunately, if they don't want to hear the message, just like at the moment BP doesn't want to hear the message that Azerbaijan is an authoritarian place that jails political opponents. One of our LSE colleagues, Gulbadi Badoglu, I worked with him, he has been imprisoned because he was investigating corruption in the oil section in Azerbaijan. But BP, and there are lots of Western NGOs, parliamentarians, MPs, raising the cause of Gubad and trying to help his release. BP conspicuously silent. So many people, whether it's oil majors profiting from oil and gas deals in these countries or other economic actors, investors, they didn't want to hear, and there are still investors operating in European investors operating in Russia. I know that Ukraine has a name and shame list of those corporate actors that just don't want to leave the Russian market. So I think it's money does talk, and I would say that that's but also wishful thinking and really very short-term thinking, not realizing that actually the war has now come to the doorstep, and very dangerously so now, with America pulling out of European defense architecture. I think it's a very, very precarious moment for you, and certainly a wake-up call for many European politicians.
And do you think the perception has changed in the West, the perception of Eastern Europe and the authoritarian diffusion? And also, do you think that enlargement of European Union is still possible, given all the developments within the EU with Hungary and
I think Trump has inadvertently, and Putin in some ways probably, and inadvertently gave an impulse to a stronger European solidarity, because without America underpinning European defense, and America kind of pursuing all kinds of trade wars, now Trump, that is more precisely, that are having a chilling effect across markets and in Europe, I think there is a growing recognition of the danger of these kind of the same right-wing populist strongmen, of which there are many in Europe as well. The dangers of these kind of people and them forging an alliance with either Putin or Trump, which is ultimately prejudicial for European security. I think this is now increasingly recognized and realized, and I hope that will give a spur to the integration and expansion of the European project. And I'm a big supporter of Ukraine and Georgia joining EU and NATO, and certainly I think that there was a missed chance in the 2000s for that to happen.
Uh, but yeah, but do you think that EU Brussels will still be eager to integrate Georgia, for instance, given the current situation and what will happen in 5 or 10 years? And also, I mean, there are so many Ukrainian experts saying that after the war, the same might happen to Ukraine. There's non-irritation politics, not to irritate Russia, not to provoke Russia. Russian new invasion might lead Ukraine to the same outcome as it led in Georgia, like the
What is what would be a propitious moment for change is some kind of political shock type situation, which will be very sudden. And that sudden shock will be the demise of the Russian leader. Nobody is immortal, and that sudden shock. Of course, I'm not saying that Russia will, some kind of a democracy will reemerge in Russia. But in that period when there is a kind of interregnum, political leader is gone, maybe we don't know what might happen. It will be a very unstable situation, but it will provide a window of opportunity for countries like Georgia and like Ukraine to perhaps free themselves completely from, Russian parts of their country that have been occupied, uh, from Russian occupation, manipulation, and infiltration, and hopefully there will be a momentum for them to join the European Union.
yeah.
I have to go soon.
Yes,
It's
final.
almost 6 o'clock here.
Yeah, I've almost overlooked Romanian case, and the final question will be about Romanian elections. And we saw that digital tools, new factor has emerged, and it might influence the democratic processes in Eastern Europe in particular. So, do you think this might become in you deciding power in the processes in the upcoming decades, or it's just another tool that will somehow be subjugated by
Well, unfortunately, the digital tools, it's a double-edged sword. Internet was supposed to be this big liberating, and social media liberating force, and we now know that it's used and abused by despots and autocrats for their own means, including for electoral manipulation purposes. So, I think the same applies to the new digital tools, and autocrats and democratic oppositions are constantly learning from each other. It's a constant back and forth. They're employing new tools, and the regime learns to crush and kind of manipulate those tools, undermine their power, and the opposition then comes up with something new that they leverage, and so it's an ongoing and iterative process, and um, let's hope that you're correct, and that the opposition will indeed leverage those, just like in the elections we see in some parts of Europe.
Yeah, let's hope. Thank you very much, Professor, for this really thoughtful conversation. And just want to say to our subscribers not to forget to like, subscribe, and share our videos. And bye.
Thank you, Livan. It was good talking to you.
Thank
Thank you.